can you hear the wind? The howl. It bites the skin of those who dare traverse the North Sea. The sounds dissipate as we near the Northland, Scandinavia, comprised of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Here, settlements are established. Farmers grafting to obtain resources. The blaring of sheep is heard, the crackling of fires and the smell of smoke. However, this peaceful domain is nearing its limits. Here, the climate is cold, and survivability is becoming increasingly difficult with the growing population, and a compromise needs to be made. Predating the outbreak of conflict, the people of Scandinavia were hunter-gatherers, in search of survival and raising their families despite the harsh conditions. In due time, around the late 7th century, a dire need for food resources would emerge. Land feuds erupted on the mainland. Farms would be pillaged by neighboring territories, led by a king deemed as such, not by royal lineage, but by ownership of farmland. This self-appointed king would gather slaves and farmhands, utilizing their numbers to expand territory and committing brutal violence with axes and swords.
The word Viking has two very different meanings. In its literal meaning, Viking in Old Norse, Vikinga, or to fara I Viking, to go on a Viking expedition, is all about raiding and piracy. So in its original meaning, Viking refers to a raider, a pirate. It's acquired a much wider usage in English today, and it's normally used to describe the whole of Scandinavian society in the period from about 750 to 1050 or 1100. This was a period when Scandinavia was fragmented. So in the course of that period of over 300 years, we see the kingdoms that we know today of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden emerging. But at the beginning of the Viking Age, there are lots of small kingdoms with very distinct identities.
Vikings were not a race, it really means raider. And they had quite a solid presence in this area because of Repton. And here we've got the tributary of the River Dun next door. So there you are, scraping away in your field as one of the locals, and then you look and see this prow coming. I mean, it's been terrifying. They can go in quite shallow water, you know, I understand from experts that they can sail in as little as 18 inches of water, so they could glide along. And of course, they weren't just people who killed people, and people in this country were killing people as well. I mean, but that was what, I'm not leaping to the defence of them. The brutality of them could be appalling, but then again, so could we. When I say we, that's if you're an Anglo-Saxon, you might be an Angle, you might be a Norman, you might be any number of other things. So brutality is part of the diet, but they had a lot of good things going on as well, the Vikings, in terms of exploration and making things, and you know, their crafts and things were very good. Women could be immensely strong, so they were definitely in this area.
Very often when these are recorded by outsiders, by the Anglo-Saxons or the Franks or the Irish, they just describe them as pagans, or as heathens, or as foreigners, or as Danes. And we use Danes not just from Denmark, but Danes from Norway, and so on. So it's very difficult to know what particular group are being described in any of the written sources. And so Vikings has become a sort of catch-all for all of these different peoples together.
Kept within the borders of their own country, this raiding was the first taste of the Viking methods. Where there is fertile land to grow food, there is power. All one would need to do is take it by force.
The Vikings followed many different gods, and we have quite detailed accounts. Their gods in origin seem to be very similar to the gods of the Anglo-Saxons. They go back to a sort of common Germanic root, and there's overlap between the southern part of the Vikings in Denmark and the northern part of the Anglo-Saxons before they came over. So we see the same gods with slightly different names, Woden and Odin. Thunor and the Viking Thor are basically the same. So multiple gods, but we have in the Scandinavian version a sort of composite account built up through many different poems and works of literature, which gives us everything from the creation of the world, from initially a sort of frosty void with nothing in it apart from an enormous floating cow, to the creation of the earth itself from the body of a giant ice giant who's killed, and his brains are used for the clouds, the skull becomes a sky, and so on. And then we have an account through to the great battle at the end of time, with various adventures of gods and men along the way. Gods, men, elves, dwarves, giants, along the way. So they believed in a wide variety of different gods, goddesses, and other magical or divine creatures. And where magic stops and religion starts is a difficult question. There wasn't an organized, systematized religion in the way that we think of religions today. There would have been very personal beliefs, and there's a very real question: how much should we think of religion at all in this period? How much do we think of belief? How much do we even think perhaps of a Viking mind or mindset? Do you believe that one particular god controls the sea, or do you know it as part of your being? And the way that they perceived the world around them, the world was full of unseen things as well as those things that were seen. And therefore we've got beliefs that people can look back to and interpret in many different ways. And different people today will have very different takes on Viking beliefs.
The Norsemen had whittled out many smaller farms within their own countries. However, it was clear that some pacts were beginning to form. Settling their differences, the plunderers set their sights on the land beyond the ocean. Along the shores of the northern inlets, boats were being built. The first of what would be a sign of international power for the Norsemen, the Viking Longship. Such ingenuity and craftsmanship would be enough to withstand the elements of naval travel and the desolation of war. These magnificent ships were revolutionary, specialized for penetration into enemy territory, narrow enough to even explore rivers, whilst maintaining a wide yield of Viking personnel and pillaged goods. Unbeknownst at the time, it would be the design for a vessel which would dominate Europe for the next 3 centuries. The year is now 793, The Vikings have set their sights on one of their earliest known targets, Lindisfarne, otherwise known as Holy Island, Northumbria.
There are two possible candidates for the first Viking raid. The first one that's given a firm date is in 793, and this is on the island of Lindisfarne off the coast of Northumbria. Lindisfarne was a monastery, and the Vikings attack it. There are descriptions of it in very colourful terms. There was a comet in the sky, so it's described as fiery dragons in the sky. There's famine, there's slaughter, there's great destruction visited on the house of God. It's clear from some of those early accounts, though, that it was not their first visit. They knew the island was there, and one of the explanations for their terrible behaviour towards the church is that the churchmen had become too ungodly, and one of the signs of this is that they were copying the hairstyles of the Vikings. So rather than having proper neat tonsures as monks, they were copying Viking hairstyles. Well, it's very unlikely that the Vikings just arrive on the beach and the monks think, oh, nice hair, I'll get that redone. And then the Vikings kill them and raid them. There's clearly ongoing behaviour, and so it can be seen and portrayed as God's judgment.
The raid on the Church of St. Cuthbert was as brutal as it was successful, securing itself as one of the most infamous, bloodiest attacks against a holy site, one which desecrated the religion as the Norsemen landed from the northeast. The monastery was looted, and many of the monks were either killed or enslaved, sending a wave of shock to the medieval Christians. In a letter addressed to Higbald, the Bishop of Lindisfarne, at the time of the attack, Priest Alcuin wrote, "The pagans have desecrated God's sanctuary, shed the blood of saints around the altar, laid waste the house of our hope, and trampled the bodies of the saints like dung on the street."
The other very early account, which could be a few years earlier or slightly later, because it's only put in a single reign somewhere between 789 and 806, is on the south coast of England, off Dorset, so within the kingdom of the West Saxons. We're told that 3 shiploads of Danes from Hordaland, which is in western Norway, arrived. They were thought to be traders, and the king's officer tried to force them to go to an appropriate place to trade, and they killed him and his men. So it's nothing like as dramatic as the attack on Lindisfarne. It may even simply be a misunderstanding that these were traders and the king's official was too forceful in trying to make them trade in one place rather than another, and in a period when everyone's carrying weapons, a disagreement got out of hand. But both of those activities are sort of interplay between raiding and trading, and the deliberate attacking of churches and monasteries seem to be features of Viking raids in the period that follow.
With the damage caused and lives lost, the presence of the Vikings had spread like wildfire in Europe, but this was just the beginning. Over the following years, Viking raids would increase, and slowly, the coastlines of Britain and Ireland were being captured by their barbarian forces. The objective of these raids was simple: to plunder portable wealth, taking the form of gold, silver, and humans taken into captivity to either be sold as slaves or to be raped and discarded. The Vikings continued to attack other monastic sites, and Alcuin continued to write letters encouraging priests and monks in Britain not to flee, though little could be done in response to the aggressive nature of these new attackers.
The idea of the Vikings being particularly vicious is something that has come down to us really from contemporary sources. They get quite a bad press in some of the contemporary accounts. This is because of their lack of respect for Christianity and Christian sites. Most of our accounts are written by monks. It was already by that stage considered inappropriate for Christians to attack each other, and particularly to attack Christian churches, although it did happen. And so what we tend to get is a description in quite colourful language of these early Viking attacks, which probably is exaggerated. It's not that they're not vicious, it's a period in which everyone was vicious, but they are described as such. They were successful warriors. They fought with very much the same sort of weapons and probably very much the same skills as Anglo-Saxons or Franks or Slavs or Celts at that time. And much of what they did seems quite unpleasant by modern standards. So a lot of their raiding, for example, was involved in slave taking. And we have accounts of them carrying off women and children as slaves. This was, again, not that unusual at the time, but to modern standards, it is quite unpleasant. Some of the particular accounts of atrocities that we find in the sagas may not have been particularly based in fact. So there's an atrocity known as the Blood Eagle, which involves ripping the chest apart and pulling the lungs out like wings. This is something we find in much later accounts. It's not described by their enemies, who are looking for negative things to say about them. There are a couple of early references that talk about making food for the eagles, but Viking poetry has a lot of reference to carrion feeding the wolves, feeding the eagles, feeding the ravens. It's not clear that that's a reference to the Blood Eagle as such. So they were violent, they were dangerous, they didn't respect Christianity. Were they nevertheless any worse than anyone else? Probably not.
Tales told of a savage Danish king who led the earliest raids, one of the most notorious yet elusive Vikings during the time, Ragnar Lothbrok. With a fleet of 120 ships, Ragnar's forces used the Seine to attack Paris, desolating the French forces. Their methods were dirty yet efficient, simply rushing into a point of interest and slaughtering all who were in sight as fast as possible. The king was intimidated by the Vikings' persistence to breach Paris. To the frustration of Odo, the count of the city, Charles offered the pillagers a payment of 700 livres, around 257 kilograms in silver, in order for them to leave and never return to French soil. Upon hearing the offer, the Vikings were now very much aware of what royalties could be taken, and instead of settling them, the offer inspired them to expand even further. And so they would remain in siege for nearly a year, remaining on the west coast and cutting off trade routes. Revenge was desired against King Aelle of Northumbria, who is said to have captured and executed Ragnar, allegedly throwing him into a pit of snakes.
Ragnar Lothbrok is a figure who appears in saga literature. He may or may not have any historical foundations. Ragnar is not an uncommon Viking name, and there are accounts of Viking leaders of that name, and it's been suggested that he can be linked with some historical events. He gains his name Lothbrok, which literally means hairy breeches or shaggy breeches, because he was wading through water, and because it was so cold was wearing furry breeches to keep them hot, and these get frozen. And people comment on that, and he then carries the nickname for the rest of his time. He's allegedly a descendant of the god Odin, and there are various humans descended from the gods within Norse mythology. He supposedly was a great raider. He's linked with attacks on Paris. He's linked with attacks on northern England. Eventually, he's captured and put into a pit and killed by snakes. He is said to have cried out that when the little piglets learned of what had become of the old boar, they would be squealing soon enough. And this is a reference to his many sons. And according to tradition, this is the reason why the sons of Ragnar then lead the so-called Great Heathen Army to England in the 860s and attack Northumbria, where he's killed in particular.
3 Icelandic sagas tell of an army that invaded England in 866, led by the sons of Ragnar and his wife Aslaug. Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, Hvitserk, and Sigurd Snake in the Eye, all of whom waged war like their father. In response to his father's death, Ivar led the Great Heathen Army to victory. He and his brothers invaded the British Isles, defeating King Aelle and King Osbert. Landing in East Anglia, the army traversed the coast and captured the city of York, marking the beginning of the Viking occupation in Europe. The conquest had only just begun. The 9-foot-tall Ivar continued to raid. Alongside Olaf the White, the Viking king of Dublin, the pair plundered and left a trail of bloodshed in their wake. The two are often known as berserkers, a trance-like state of fury which many Vikings would adopt. In Old Norse, the name would translate to bearskin, a member of unruly warrior gangs that worshipped Odin. It is hypothesized such warriors would ingest a hallucinogenic mushroom, Amanita muscaria, also known as fly agaric.
One of the most decisive periods in the development of England came in the period 865 to 79. And a group arrived in England which is labelled either as the Great Army or the Great Pagan Army or Heathen Army. And it's a larger group of Vikings than had been typical. Early raids were sometimes only a few ships, perhaps 100, 200 men at most. Now we get a fleet of hundreds of ships and thousands of men, in some cases bringing women and children with them, and campaigning in hostile territory for years on end. Early raids had been hit and run, in effect. They'd come, they'd taken, they'd gone. What happens in this period from 865 onwards is they arrive, they establish camps within one or other of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and they gradually moved around, taking tribute and basically making an enforced peace with the local ruler. The clever bit was arriving in the middle of winter. They had their ships with them, and the ships allowed them to penetrate deep inland. They go as far from the sea as it's possible to get, going up major rivers like the Trent and the Thames and the Severn. So they could turn up pretty much anywhere. Those ships allowed them to carry large quantities of supplies as well as loot. They would very quickly gather horses if they hadn't already got them, which meant they could have fast-moving troops overland supported by this fleet. And arriving in winter, it was very difficult to muster an army against them, particularly if they arrived quickly and taking people by surprise, and grabbed all the food in the surrounding area. That meant that any army coming in to counter them would have nothing to live off if they arrived. So it was easier to make peace on the agreement normally that they would move on to another kingdom the following year. And so they move around for a number of years, killing the kings of some of the kingdoms. So they killed the king of East Anglia, they killed two of the kings of Northumbria, a king of Mercia was forced into exile where he died, another king of Mercia just disappears from the record, and we don't know what happened to him, but suddenly Mercia is being divided up between the Vikings and Alfred of the West Saxons. So almost certainly there's a peace accord there, and they decide, you can have this bit, I'll have this bit, and we won't attack each other.
In 865 AD, England was divided into 4 kingdoms. The conquest allowed the Vikings to take Northumbria, before dominating Mercia and East Anglia. The king of East Anglia, Edmund the Martyr, met a gruesome end. Ubba Ragnarsson, the leader of the Danes, and Ivar the Boneless dominated the territory, executing Edmund after his refusal to renounce Christ. Alongside the Great Heathen Army was the Great Summer Army, led by the king of East Anglia, Guthrum, and Bersi, a Danish monarch. Forming a pact between the two armies, Guthrum led the expanding heathens to conquer the kingdoms of Anglo-Saxon England. Their conquest, however, fell short, as the Vikings suffered a huge defeat at Eddington, Wiltshire, in 878, a bloody battle that lasted for 6 days. Following King Alfred's victory at the battle, a treaty was signed between himself and warlord Guthrum, known as the Treaty of Wedmore. Guthrum's surrender meant the Vikings would leave the kingdom immediately, and Guthrum, their king, would be sworn into Christianity and receive baptism at King Alfred's hand. A line crossed the kingdom, separating the forces. The Danish Viking territory would be known as Danelaw. The beating heart of York and surrounding settlements of Nottingham, Lincoln, Derby, Leicester and Stamford.
Large parts of England, the whole of what had been the kingdom of the East Angles, the whole of the kingdom of Northumbria, and a large part of the old kingdom of Mercia ended up in Viking hands, and they changed from this period of year-on-year campaign, just permanent settlement. And we see that in the archaeology, we see it in the place names. So, for example, in areas like Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, East Anglia, there's a lot of places with names ending BY. So Grimsby, for example. BY is a village or farm, and typically they're combined with a personal name. And these areas are full of Scandinavian place names, whether it's the village names or geographical features. Skegness, for example, means beard-shaped headland, which is a navigational point along the coast and across the North Sea, is quite important. And if you look at it on a map, you'll see that Skegness is on a headland that sticks down like a little beard from that part of the coast. So there's a lasting legacy of Scandinavian settlement. We see towns growing up under the Vikings in those areas, which hadn't been there before, or at least hadn't been there before on a large scale, like York and Lincoln, Thetford in Norfolk. In later years, once England had become a single kingdom again, this area is referred to as the Danelaw, because it had been under Scandinavian rule for so long, and so Danish is a generic term for Scandinavians. Danish law was still followed for a few generations after England became unified, in contrast to the south and the west, where English law had remained in place. So this legacy of a concept of the Danelaw remained even after unification.
Peace, however, was not an option. Northern Scotland would also become the Vikings' domain, with the Hebrides, Shetland Isles, and Orkneys, all falling under Norse control. The Vikings began a series of raids in the Mediterranean. A few years later, Oleg the Wise led a force to Constantinople, now known as Istanbul. He was well paid to turn and leave. The intimidation tactics of the invaders proved to be most effective and near unbeatable.
The Vikings fought with a number of weapons. Probably the most common is the spear. The spear is very good because it's cheap. You only require quite a small amount of iron for the spearhead. The rest of it was wood, but it gives you a good long reach, and it can either be used as a thrusting, stabbing weapon or as a throwing weapon. It's often suggested that they didn't really use bows and arrows much. The surviving bows that we have are very powerful. They're as powerful as late medieval longbows. They would certainly have been capable of punching arrows through the shields that were used at the time. We do sometimes get skeletal remains with arrows in. So archery was probably much more important than it's given credit for, but because it's not as glamorous as the hand-to-hand fighting that we see in all the films, I think archery is sometimes neglected. Hand-to-hand weapons, we have the sword as the most glamorous weapon and the most high-status weapon. It's expensive just because of the amount of metal that it uses, and it can then be made even more impressive with gold or silver on the hilt fittings, so it becomes a symbol of power, a symbol of identity. Swords are sometimes passed down from one family member to another as heirlooms. There's an account in Arabic sources, supposedly of a Viking father throwing a sword down in front of an infant child and saying, "There's your legacy. It's up to you to make what you will with that. And if you don't succeed, that's your problem." Another very common weapon is the axe, and axe come in various shapes and sizes. There are small axes that could be used with one hand and a shield in the other, smaller heads, heavier heads, sometimes hooked heads which could be used to hook the shield out of the way and then bash in with the axe. We also see the development in the later Viking Age of big double-handed axes. These don't seem to actually be there at the beginning, although you get them in all the films. But they're a later development, probably as a reaction to the introduction of cavalry. And these are axes that you can use to take a horse's legs out from under it. They're quite slow and cumbersome in hand-to-hand combat, but they are very, very effective, and you can smash through a lot with one of those, even if it's blunt. Most Viking warriors in the early part of the Viking Age, at least, probably didn't have much in the way of armour. We don't have a lot that actually survives. The one thing that we do have surviving in large numbers is the metal boss from the middle of a shield. So the Viking shield is a large wooden shield that covers basically the body, and in the middle of that there's a metal boss that protects the hands. Most of our knowledge of Viking weapons and armour comes from graves, so it may just be that shields were put in graves and more expensive items like helmets and body armour weren't put in there so often. So we have Frankish laws which specifically say you may not sell weapons and armour to the Vikings, which is pretty clear indication that it was happening for those laws to be made. The helmets that we see in pictures are straightforward conical helmets. So there's a helmet going up, protecting the top of the head, and with a simple nose guard. And these appear on stone carvings. There are some little figures showing them. We also have a few examples from the Viking Age and just before in Scandinavia of helmets with protective pieces around the eyes. The lower face is left bare, which is good in terms of breathing, but the nose and eyes are protected by almost a spectacle and the top of the head. Sometimes there's mail hanging down, protecting as well. What none of these helmets have is the one thing that Vikings are probably best known for today, which is horns on their helmets. And we have no evidence of the Vikings actually having that. This is something which is made up in the 19th century when the Vikings were being reinvented and popularised, and the notion of the Viking was taking off, and people were starting to write books about them and illustrate those books, and they illustrated the Vikings as they thought they should have been rather than as they were. And there are other periods in history where horned helmets were known, and the artists were just borrowing anything that they liked the look of, that they saw in museums, and like, let's give the Vikings those as well. So we've got Bronze Age helmets from Scandinavia that have horns on, had nothing to do with the Vikings, but they look good.
The Vikings continued to wage conflict against their Anglo-Saxon counterparts. Many Anglo-Saxon rulers made deals with the Vikings, offering them Danegeld, silver, in exchange for the Vikings not invading their land. Eric Bloodaxe was in power during Danelaw's end. In 954, he was driven out of Northumbria. The Anglo-Saxons regained power and land. Eric, the King of Norway and Northumbria, would be ambushed on the bleak moors of Stainmoor and murdered alongside 5 other kings. After the battles waged throughout the remaining Viking territory, Eric the Red would discover Greenland. Expelled from Norway and later Iceland, Greenland would act as a place of solace, with Eric settling, landing 25 ships, people and goods. Within 20 more years, over 3,000 Vikings were now occupying the new homeland as farmers. It was 995 when Olaf Tryggvason, Norway's new Viking king, would build the first Christian church in Norway. After spending time in the Isles of Scilly, a seer is said to have foreseen a battle in which King Olaf would suffer terrible injuries and convert his faith. Not long after, the king was indeed attacked, and he duly converted. Returning to Norway, he brought with him a newfound faith, which would change the course of the Viking lifestyle. For those that refused conversion, trade restrictions would be imposed. The faith was spreading throughout Iceland and Greenland, with Olaf even converting chieftains to his new religion. He would die at sea at the Battle of Svolder in the year 1000, some say by taking his own life, jumping into the water in full armour, rather than see his forces defeated. The year is now 1015, and the days of Viking rule started to wane. Vinland, the North American settlement, is abandoned. Supplies were limited, and trade with Scandinavia was too arduous given the distance of their locale. King Olaf II, later known as Saint Olaf, was defeated in 1030 during the Battle of Stiklestad. To honour the saint, churches and shrines were built in his honour across Europe, though many speculate that Olaf may have even been killed by his own people.
In the autumn of 1066, England was threatened from 2 directions. Harold Godwinson, now established firmly as king, was well aware that there was likely to be an invasion from Normandy, and had been watching the south coast through the summer. He'd gathered troops along the south coast. William had been prevented by bad weather from crossing, and as they got into September, Harold's troops in the south were running out of food and money, and it was felt that it was unlikely now that William would be able to come as the autumn storms arrived. So the troops in the south were disbanded. But while he was watching the south, there was another threat from the north, and this was led by two people. One of these was Harold Hardrada, Harold Hardcastle, King of Norway. The other was Harold Godwinson's own brother, Tostig. Tostig had been Earl of Northumbria under Edward the Confessor, but he'd been extremely unpopular in the north of England and had been kicked out of his role there. Harold had failed to support him, contrary to his expectations. Because the earlier Viking attacks on England had left quite a strong presence in northern and eastern England, Harold was hopeful that he would get support from the sort of mixed Anglo-Scandinavian population and that he would be able to hold on to the north even if he couldn't conquer the south. But he promised to divide it with Harold Godwinson's brother Tostig in any case. While this was going on, Harold Godwinson was marching north. He wasn't in time to meet up with Edwin and Morcar at Fulford, but he was only a few days away. Harold Hardrada of Norway had moved to the east of York to a place called Stamford Bridge, where it had been arranged that the people of York would bring hostages out to him, and he was encamped on the side of a river by the bridge. But rather than the people of York coming out to meet him, it was Harold Godwinson and the army that he'd brought north, together with what was left of the northern army that Harold Hardrada had already defeated. But he wasn't expecting battle. He was taken to some extent by surprise.
King Harold Hardrada, younger half-brother of Olaf II and widely known as the last real Viking, took his final stand against Harold Godwinson at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Harold Godwinson would himself be defeated just 19 days later by William, Duke of Normandy, at the Battle of Hastings.
There's a mixture of traditions about this, and it's described in later Norse literature. Sorting out the actual fact from the fiction is not entirely straightforward. Supposedly, the bridge was defended at Stamford Bridge by one heroic Viking who fought off all attackers until someone came under the bridge on a boat and stabbed him through the bridge itself with a spear, which was thought by both sides to be quite unsporting, but did at least clear the bridge so Harold Godwinson's army could get over. It's a hot day, according to the sources, and so the Norwegian army had left their armour off, and although some of them were now putting it on in the time that was saved by the heroic warrior on the bridge, not all of them had armour to put on. There's then a long and hard-fought battle which resulted in Harold of Norway and Tostig both being killed. One tradition says he's killed with an arrow, but we don't really know. There'd been a negotiation before the battle with Harold Godwinson asking what terms the Harold of Norway and Tostig would accept just to go away, and he was willing to make some sort of deal with his brother, but when he was asked how much of England would he give to Harold of Norway, he promised him just 6 feet of English ground, enough to bury him in, or, as he said, or as much more as is needed because he's taller than most people. So that's all that Harold of Norway got. In the end, the fleet was dispersed, although he'd gathered a large army from Norway and from the Norse settlements in Scotland. Most of this was destroyed, and his son was allowed to take the rest of it away and became known as Olaf the Peaceful from the peaceful reign that he followed thereafter.
When one thinks of the Vikings, we picture their raids, their barbaric nature, and their traversal of the oceans. But they were so much more. A collective of farmhands, people fighting for their own survival, people who had no access to resources the kingdoms of Europe and the Americas took for granted. They even lacked military education. What came from desperate conditions was an idea that would shift the tides of war and their own prosperity. From famine, an idea rose that would grant them not only comfort for their people, but a place in Valhalla. To make a conquest, to take and claim with sheer willpower. And such strength always remains embedded in what we know of the Vikings today.